One of the things that we're um, seeing a lot across these chapters is the significance of reflection. And Amanda, you spoke to this a little bit earlier in terms of your own experience working with your students. Um, I'm wondering how might these written reflections be adapted for different students, whether it's different age groups, different disciplines, different cultural backgrounds, folks with different prior experiences. What are some of the ways that we might think about using reflections not necessarily as a one size fits all, but to help each student move from where they are along a progression? Um, Recognizing that there are also limitations in terms of faculty time as well.
It's an interesting thing. So I was actually last week working with some colleagues on some other global learning type studies that are sort of advancing the work from Mind the Gap. And one of the things that we talked about a great deal was students' resistance to reflection. That reflection activities feel like busy work to them, that they really don't like having to do it. They don't see the value in it. They're just very resistant to it. And one of the things that sort of I took away from that I've kind of seen, I guess, in my own classes too, is that motivation for the reflection is really helpful. And that happens even when they're doing pre-experience reflection, but also when they do it post. So for example, when I have the students do the activities where they might meet the culture that they're going to see or practice, I guess, meeting a different culture, they extremely resent that. But if I frame it as, if you do this, here's what you're going to learn from it, they take it a lot better to do that.
Jesse, we've experimented in our the class that students take while concurrently in our department as they study abroad. And this semester in particular, I gave the student options of creating video logs, of using different mediums. Some were doing kind of podcasty, kind of audio recordings. Some were doing embedded photos within a Google Doc, and they were kind of journaling and keeping track, right? So it was much more, I framed it much more as a tool for them, and that they needed to find their own kind of style. I had somebody who created their own kind of blog right outside of the kind of their own WordPress, and they that was not connected in any way to the course, but it was their own. And then they just kind of told me, I want you to look at this week, those kinds of things. So I think that we can be much more flexible. I also think in learning that we've in implementing that, we've also lost a little bit of the critical analysis level. So I've allowed for a lot more variety and uniqueness, which is really, really rewarding. But my students are still glossing over some really important things. So now it's going to be when they return, right, in our course, or in a return course, of really having to dig down and analyzing where they're glossing and why they might be glossing. So I think a little bit of a balance of saying, you need to do these three, right, that kind of thing, and at your own pace and at some time because of something that happens to you as an experience, but still allowing for an much more flexibility, I think can help balance the need for kind of individualization, right? And again, Amanda, for you, that motivation kind of aspect, like if it's mine, then maybe I can work with it, right? I'll be more invested in it. But there is also a possibility that they kind of gloss, right? So we have to be looking for that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make, because I brought up the sort of social media factor that is included in that as well. And one of the things that we know from multiple pedagogies where you have to encounter difference is that if it's not like well scaffolded, right, and well reflected on, it tends to sort of entrench pre-existing attitudes. This is a big issue in service learning in particular, but it's also a big issue in global learning. And so, Jesse, I think you brought up a good point of like the faculty time that they can put into that, because if the students are doing sort of free form, you know, just write down something about this. And I have literally seen students being sent for experiences and being told, well, you should keep a journal. Like the extent of it. Nobody was ever going to read it, and they never said how or anything like that. I feel like you're setting yourself up for failure in that. So thinking about ways to sort of have some kind of audience, I guess, even if it was, I've seen this, you know, in study abroad when people will like talk about their host families in culturally insensitive and, you know, frankly insulting ways, and saying, what would this person think if they read what you wrote? You know, in some cases, they'll even keep those kind of reflections and they'll keep them on a public blog where that person could actually go and read what they wrote. And you're just like, oh, that is very bad. But thinking about building in chances for students to respond to each other in their reflections, I feel like group reflections work really well. And I particularly like photo elicitation for that. So I actually go around and I take pictures of my students as they're doing the things over the day. And then over dinner, we have a slideshow. We talk about the slideshow and, you know, this happened and here you are doing this thing and here's this person and they're reacting in this way. And why do you think they're reacting in this way? And, you know, those kinds of things. I feel like those sort of group reflection things can be very powerful and don't really have to be graded. So Nina brought up a good point too, when she was talking about the reflection and talking about having the students go back and analyze their own reflections afterwards. And you can do that with pre-reflection as well. Things that they've thought about before they went that they were going to expect, and then like how it met or didn't meet those expectations and what that means.
And that was anticipating the next question I was going to ask, because I was going to ask if you wanted to comment a little bit more on the ways that we can encourage students to reflect on their preparation to go off campus, whether domestically or abroad. I know the authors of chapter 3, or maybe you as editors, raised the question in our discussion questions online of whether there requires special classes or if there are other ways to do that successfully. But do you have some thoughts on how to encourage students to do that pre-departure or that preparation reflection?
So if it were up to me, I think it would be actually looking at first year courses, right? So one of the things that I feel that I come up an awful lot to is that students, a barrier for them is not understanding in structural racism, structural prejudice, structural inequality, kind of root causes of oppression, of why things work the way they work in different countries, right? And it's a lot to tackle like right before, right? And also it's a lot to tackle kind of at when they're studying abroad, for instance. You know, when students face certain things and they're like, oh, well, you know, the French are, or whatever blatant statement that they say, the French are racist, you know? And it's like, wow, okay, how are you interpreting it? Why would that phrase, would you perceive it as, what is that action as? What are the root causes, right? So if they don't even know, like if they don't understand colonialism and imperialism, it's really difficult for them to gauge in those. So for me, I would love to see a lot of this integrated into, kind of built into the entire curriculum and the entire experience, so that it's not, as Amanda said, everything all at the same time, because then they can either shut down or they can then do that really easy glossing, right? But of course, I also believe firmly in intentional interventions. So I'm going to be the one who's going to be like, yes, we need to have, you know, pre-departure that is cultural orientation, not logistics, right? And we need, but that could potentially be just online online modules, right, of intercultural learning in some way to see where they're at, to kind of give that kind of thing. And then also reintegration as well, support when they come back. I don't know if every student needs a structured course, but I do think more support is definitely necessary for pre, during, and post in some way. And we should be able to offer kind of pathways for students to be able to do that. So that was my take.
One really cool thing that one of our groups found in the seminar was that you can actually use your instrument as an intervention. So they gave the IDI pre and post. We've already talked about this group before. And part of the IDI is doing a debrief afterwards. And this is true with some other measures of intercultural learning as well. And they found that when they looked at the students' reflections afterwards, that the students were expressly pulling in language and ideas from that debrief with the instrument in their reflections. And I feel like, getting back to one of the first questions, that can be a really good way to have students think about sort of where they started and where they're going, because people like numbers. And so sometimes those more quantified things feel more real. I'm not sure they are, but they feel like they are more real. And so that can be a good way to get student engagement in the process, because they also like to talk about themselves.
And one of the folks who is involved in that has just raised his hand to speak. So I'm going to unmute him. Mike Kerrigan, do you want to take a moment to add to that?
Hi there. Yeah, I couldn't help jumping in because Amanda set the stage so nicely. Thank you for teeing that up for us. It was one of my favorite things that we discovered in doing that study, was that having a kind of systematic protocol for collecting reflections actually made intercultural development a theme in the course as far as the students were concerned. And so they became more articulate about what it means. They had a much more developed sense of what higher levels of intercultural learning and behavior look like, and understood that it was a goal. And so it naturally became something that some of them would strive for. So yes, you said it just right, and I just wanted to sort of clap my hands about that. Making it the study, the assessment became an intervention.
Thanks, Mike, for jumping on for that.